produced by the Federation of the Covenant People, P.O. Box 830, Honeydew, postal code 2040, South Africa. My name is Finlay, and the title of this address is Majority Mania, in which we will discuss this most important subject, its causes and its errors. Now, throughout history, the word majority, no matter in which language it was used, had a strange effect upon the course of nations. In the ancient Egyptian experience, you'll recall the measures adopted by the Pharaoh when the population statistics indicated that the Israelites were beginning to outnumber the Egyptians, and how the male children were executed in order to reduce the Israel majority ratio in the overall population. From the earliest times, the word majority was synonymous with power. And as we pass through history, this factor has emerged time and time again, with one exception, that being the Bible story of Israel. I would like to spend a few moments in considering this exception, for the principles involved, whether people agree with our identification of God's covenant people with the Anglo-Saxon and kindred European nations or not, are principles which need to be rediscovered at this time when majority mania is busily engaged in writing the epitaph to the white race, an epitaph to which so many in the white race are wholeheartedly subscribing. Now, firstly, in considering this Israel story, let us consider those principles which God gave to his people. And the first point to which I would like to draw your attention is the fact that, notwithstanding the so-called threat posed to the Egyptians, God's people were in the minority. If you take the trouble to read the account in Exodus 1 again, you will see that while Israel multiplied greatly, the period of their sojourn in the land was just over 200 years, compared with that of the Egyptians, which was well over 2,000 years. Jacob, you will recall, went into Egypt with just 70 people, and notwithstanding the excessive virility, they could never have posed the threat implied by the Pharaoh. The threat of Israel becoming a majority was used by the Pharaoh to his economic advantage, and this is what the whole story was all about. Now, I'm not going to deal with the economic exploitation of Israel and Egypt and the results of this. The story can be read in the Scriptures. Let us rather consider and concern ourselves with the principles involved in the subsequent story. Now, if we turn to Deuteronomy 7 and verse 7, we note that there is a reference to Israel being the fewest of all people, which certainly puts them in the minority role. The white race today, when world population statistics are considered, too occupies the position of the world's minority. Now, this 7th chapter of Deuteronomy is the account of the directive to be followed by God's people when they took possession of the land of Canaan, which at that time was occupied by 7 nations, each of which constituted a majority when compared with the Israelites. Now, before proceeding with this story, have you noticed that I am not speaking of the Jews? If you're following this very carefully, and you know, I sincerely hope that you are, because the subject is vital to the survival of the white race generally and God's covenant people specifically, you should check the Bible account again and note the total absence of the word Jew. We are speaking of biblical Israel, and not the modern spurious counterfeit which makes pretensions which are not backed by anything but modern propaganda. Now, I want to read verse 2 of Deuteronomy 7, and I would like you to listen very carefully to the principles involved in this. Now, this is what is recorded. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them, that is, of course, the 7 nations of Canaan, and when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them, and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show any mercy unto them. I know that many people would say that this is very unchristian. But is it any more unchristian than the utter barbarism and inhumanity which is practiced under the sponsorship and the blessing of the World Council of Churches? I think that before anything is castigated as unchristian and smeared with the implications which have come to be accepted as associated with this term, one should take another long look at what passes for Christianity and measure this with what God has said in his Word. Now, if we continue with Deuteronomy 7, we note that integration, which somehow or other has become associated with the pinnacle of Christian behavior today, is very much out. Let us read what it says. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. Now, superficially, this may appear to be a religious instruction, whereas a little research will show that it has very strong political overtones. If the history of those 7 nations is considered again, particularly in the light of archaeological evidence, it will be seen that religion was their politics, and politics their religion. Their gods were their kings, and their kings were their gods. Now, this may sound strange, so let us amplify it. Traditionally, the king was the highest authority in the land, and as such, he assumed deity in order to perpetuate his dynasty, and thus he enacted legislation and endowed it with religious overtones to ensure the success of the enterprise. Thus politics was clothed with religious veneer. And when God forbade Israel to make both national and individual covenants with them, the prohibition was aimed at maintaining God's political structure on which his nation was to be built. Now, perhaps you will see why it is that I say this statement by God, you will not make any covenant with them, and the reason for which they will turn away their heart from following after me. It has political overtones only when you get into and understand the background story concerning those other nations. Against this, of course, there are those who would say that if an alien came to accept the polity, the Israel polity as such, there could be no reason why integration and intermarriage could not take place. Let me say at once that no such provision is made in the polity of God. If you examine the Constitution which God gave to his people, you will note that it is the most discriminating document which has ever come into the hands of man. Now, I have no intention of dealing with this in detail here. It's been done on previous recordings. But to summarize, we may see that racially akin people, after accepting all the clauses associated with the Constitution, are permitted to operate and to function and to live within the community. Others, and these appear still to be within the framework of the same race, but are products of incest and the like, are permitted within the community, but with very limited privileges. Others again, and these appear to be specifically racial aliens, are not permitted into the community at all. Thus, in terms of the immigration laws in God's Constitution, intermarriage and integration across the race barrier just could not happen. In the light of this, the question would not arise based on the premise that an alien could accept the Israel polity and thereby becoming integrated with God's people. It just couldn't exist. Now, in continuing with the Israel story, it would appear from a superficial reading of the story that God accepted the principle of democracy, which, as we know and as will be discussed presently, centers on the will of the majority. Now, we know from the account in 1 Samuel, in the 8th chapter, that the people, through their elders, decided that they wanted a king like the surrounding nations. Up to this moment in time, they were a theocracy. They were governed by the judges. Now they rejected this situation, and they wanted a king like the surrounding nations. We know that God acceded to this demand by the majority, but at the same time, he showed them the consequences of this exercise of democracy. If you read verses 11 to 18 of the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, you will see the foreknowledge of God in action, for he shows the price that the people must pay in exercising their democratic rights. And the price is, wait for it, the exploitation of the people. In giving in to their cry for democratic rule, God nevertheless still provided a directive for the people. For in the matter of choosing a king or a ruler, or for that matter a government, a principle was to be observed, and this principle is, one, from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. This you will find recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, verse 15. The type of stranger referred to here is determined by the word brother, which in Hebrew is ach, A-C-H, which means a literal relationship and is a racial term. Therefore, the directive is that insofar as government is concerned, this should comprise a person or persons who are racially akin to the people government. We should always bear this principle in mind as we proceed. It is a directive which demands that in the question of election, the electorate should be the same, and they should only elect one of their own kind to be ruler over them. Now, as I said earlier, this comment on the Israel story was intended to be a very brief outline of principles involved in the administration of a people who were in the minority. Now, I would like us to pass on, not with the Bible story of God's covenant people, because this, as the Bible makes abundantly clear, is one of disregarding the principles of God and the impact of aliens on the national polity. You can read of this, if you wish, in Isaiah, the 1st chapter, verses 1 to 7. You can read of it in Hosea, the 4th chapter, verse 6, in Hosea, the 5th chapter, verse 7, and again in the 7th chapter, verses 1 through to 9. I would rather like us now, at this moment, to consider secular history, as this provides the basis for the modern mania of majority rule. And as we do consider the secular history, let us bear in mind that the underlying principles which comes to us, as it were, from the very womb of eternity, is most specific, that the area of people to be governed must be governed by that people and not some heterogeneous population who have been created for purposes best known to those who utilize this means of polluting and perverting a nation. In 1863, and at Gettysburg in the United States, Abraham Lincoln, during the course of his speech, laid the foundation principle on which modern democracy has been built. Now, I would like to quote his speech in its entirety, for the full impact of this is to be found not in taking the last passage, but to take the whole thing. And this is what he said. I am quoting now the actual speech of Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can endure. We are met on this great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place of those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here. They who have fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln was, of course, not very original in his quotation, and there are many who will agree with me, adding that he took the quote from the preface of the Wycliffe Bible of 1384. It is suggested that this preface states that, and I quote, "the Bible shall be for the government of the people," etc., etc. But, my friends, if such a preface did exist, the 1850 version of the Wycliffe Bible did not carry it. In point of fact, if we go back in history, we find that the slogan, "the government of the people, by the people, for the people," was coined and used in Greece in 430 BC, a fact which appears to have been the source of the definition of direct democracy as provided by the Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge. Under this caption it was stated, and I'm quoting the relevant portion, "The concept of direct democracy was developed in the city-states of Greece in the 5th century BC. All the citizens, a category excluding women and slaves, were entitled to vote and to attend the General Assembly. They were also eligible for a wider variety of judicial and administrative posts, which were filled either by election or by drawing lots." End of quote. Here, as with most comments on principles which are rooted in the past, we have history written in such a way as to support the modern version of the relevant event. If, however, we consult reference books which were printed before literature became the useful tool in the hands of the opinion makers, we see a somewhat different story. In the 1926 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, we find the story of the Athenian Greek Cleon, who coined and used the slogan of the government of the people, by the people, for the people, and the circumstances under which this modern slogan was given birth is very, very interesting. All in all, it turned out to be a political gimmick used on the people to advance Cleon's personal position. You know, he was born into the ranks of the workers. His father, Cleonatus, was a tanner or a leather dresser, and from an early age Cleon aimed his violent manner and language against the aristocracy in Athens. Like so many of our modern revolutionaries, he was quite a speaker on the public platform, and just as the Russian revolutionaries had a war as a backdrop to their revolutionary talk, so too Cleon had the Peloponnesian War, which was being directed by Pericles. Cleon directed his tirades against the policy of the war, demanding that the people who were called upon to fight the war should have some say not only in the policy of the war, but in the overall policy dictated by the aristocratic assembly at Athens. This is the point where the government of the people, by the people, for the people came in. In playing on this slogan, Cleon was totally successful in gaining admittance to the elite assembly in Athens by popular and majority request. However, he had no sooner gained this promotion when he did a complete turn-about-face. Having used his slogan to good advantage, and having waged his campaign on the grounds that the war was not good for the people but for the aristocracy alone, he now became a radical warmonger, urging the assembly to exact incredible and inhuman retribution against all who opposed the Athenian rule. During the 9 years which followed his admission to the assembly at Athens, he was convicted on several occasions for extorting money from those who were subject to the Athenian rule. And the mechanism for this extortion was the creation of what we today would call government agencies, which had control over the various phases of national life under the Athenian jurisdiction. Cleon finally met his death when the Athenian assembly, thoroughly disgusted at his exploitation of the people whom he had championed and rallied under the slogan, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, having become thoroughly disgusted with him, they sent him on a campaign against the Lacedaemonians, during which half the Athenian army and Cleon perished. Now, as far as is known, Cleon's was the first use of the slogan, the government of the people, by the people, for the people. And again, as far as is known, or at least as far as is historically verifiable, Lincoln was the next to use it. We do know that some 74 years prior to the Gettysburg Address, which was made while the American Civil War was still in progress, that the sentiments expressed by Lincoln were embodied in the French revolutionary cry, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which finally toppled the French monarchy and aristocracy and established republican government. If we sift through the evidence available, the parallel in purpose behind both the French Revolution and the American Civil War is very obvious. In France, the people thought that they now had control over their own destiny, and that in the new dispensation, the revolutionary slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity, would be put into their own experience. They did not see the abstractness in their popular slogan. They did not see the contradiction in their meaning and interrelation. They did not see that in nature there is no equality, cannot be freedom, that nature itself has established inequality of minds, of characters and capacities, just as immutably as she has established subordination to her laws. The people did not stop to analyze the situation, and blinded to reality by the dazzling promise of participation in government, they missed the fact that a power struggle was taking place at the top, and that in the next 50 years, 2 further revolutions were to be a clear pointer to persons behind the scenes who were manipulating French politics and using the people as pawns. The French Revolution, my friends, was the turning point in modern history. And if we think of the bloodshed, the reign of terror that was manifest at this particular time in the French Revolution, we will see that there was something more to the story than the government of the people, by the people, for the people. This was only a slogan. It was a con trick. The people themselves underwent a tremendous amount of intrigue and bloodshed in this French Revolution. They tried and they tried again to try and pull something out of the ruins. And I'm talking about the people themselves. I'm not talking about those who are manipulating things. The people themselves tried time and time and time again to get back onto an even keel. The change of leadership at the top was too incredible for words. Do you know they even recalled the monarchy to take over? Then they rescinded this again, and then they went back to the monarchy, and then they threw it all over again. The whole of this story of this French Revolution must be understood fully to understand the projection of that situation into today's event, because, believe it or not, we are reliving the story of the revolution once again in this day and age in which we live. Now, if we pass from France to America, leaving the French scene in 1850 with Paris again the scene of tremendous insurrection and bloodshed, this time crystallizing into the responsibility of party political socialists, we note that notwithstanding historical platitudes which were used to justify the American Civil War, socialism and communism were inherent in the abolitionism which was at the root of the war between the Federalists and the Confederates. To recapitulate the last words which we said on the other side of this tape, notwithstanding the historical platitudes which were used to justify the Civil War, socialism and communism were inherent in the abolitionism which was at the root of the war between the Federalists and the Confederates. If we remember the revolutionary slogan of France, liberty, equality, and fraternity in 1789, and recall the government of the people, by the people, for the people in 1863, it becomes patently obvious that there is at least a tie-up somewhere between the two. In America, the people, again, the area of exploitation, were energized. No, that's not perhaps the right word. Let us say rather that the people were controlled through an environmental psychology which had been created by Lincoln's emotional 600 words address at Gettysburg. Always deeply emotional, the American people were conned both politically and religiously, and it should not come as a shock to any to realize that today's social gospel, that incredible anti-biblical religious propaganda, had its beginning immediately after the Gettysburg Address. I would like to project this situation in America, which created the social gospel, into our present time, and in doing this, I would like to draw your attention to the World Council of Churches, which is effectively the voice of Christendom in the world, and which had its birth in 1948, succeeding the National Council of Churches, which in turn succeeded the Federal Council, which arose because of the social gospel in the United States of America. Now, while within the world Christian community, the World Council of Churches has varying degrees of influence, it should be noted that the World Council of Churches is using Marxism as the instrument for its one world policy. Marxism, of course, makes its appeal to all mankind to shed its parochial loyalties and to accept the brotherhood of man. And only then, so it is claimed, will the artificial barriers of class and belief be thrown down. The Marxist, socialists, and radical theologians who staff the upper levels of the World Council of Churches do not, in point of fact, subscribe to the policy of social evolution, as do so many of the moderate socialists. They are aggressive in their assistance to evolution, and have stated quite openly that a Western bourgeois culture is dying, and that capitalism must be replaced by socialism. Their policy, so it would appear, centers on one word: liberty. And so they contend, just as Christian men liberated others from captivity to idols of wood and of stone, today he must liberate men from the captivity of politics and trade exercised by Western nations. I don't think that there's very much more need be said of the World Council of Churches, except to quote the General Secretary of that organization, Philip Potter, who said, and I'm going to quote his words here, "Everywhere there are liberation movements struggling against political, economic, racial, social, and male oppression. The word liberation frightens many Christians, especially those who are citizens of countries which one way or the other maintain or support the oppression of the people. But liberation is a good biblical word, for that is what salvation means." Unquote. All I ask is that you look back on history, even the brief history which has been provided in this tape, and note how people have been exploited by this term, liberty. I would now like to return to the slogan, the government of the people, by the people, for the people. As we have seen, it was used to great effect in early Greece. And while we certainly cannot ascribe to it the downfall of that great empire, the principle behind it can very definitely be said to be responsible for the collapse of what history calls the Greco-Roman concept of human society. Then we have seen the same principle in operation in the French Revolution, to be followed by the American Civil War and Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg. Since that time, the principle, if not the words, have dominated the nations of the Western world. And in Britain, you know, we have Benjamin Disraeli, the first and only Jew to become Prime Minister of Britain, some 15 years after the Gettysburg Address, used almost the identical words. He is on record as having said, and I'm going to quote here, "All power is a trust, that we are accountable for its exercise, that from the people and for the people all springs, and all must exist." You'll note here again that the word people is the authority. And if we take those whom this word covered when both Lincoln and Disraeli made their speeches, we will note that in essence the composition of the population was entirely different to that of today. This is a fact which should be borne in mind, for even if we allow for the authority of the people to be the last word in government, those whom they elect in what we may call representative democracy would be men of their own stock, which of course takes us right back into the Bible and brings us into line with what God said concerning the choosing of rulers, and which, as I have said, is recorded in Deuteronomy 17, 1815. Now, I want to say, and this is very important to our subject majority mania, that no individual can be held responsible for what uses men make of statements made in a given context. We have fantastic examples, in the religious sphere of what men have said God meant when he made certain statements. For example, when God declared that he intended to accomplish the blessing of nations via the function of his covenant nation, men say that what he really meant was that through the church he would do this. This, is a perfect example of twisting and using things that have been said to men's own advantage. The point here is that men transpose, for their own convenience, statements which are made and historically recorded. Let me go a little bit further. I'm not concerning us now with the French Revolution at this stage. The people of France, as I have said before, were indeed the pawns used by sinister forces which have been and are still at work to subjugate the Western world. I would rather that we look at those same sinister forces, what they have made out of Lincoln's speech and that of Disraeli. It has been implied today that the government of the people, for the people, by the people, is the open sesame to everyone within the national perimeters to have an equal say in the matter of government. Let me say at once that this is not, unless he is an absolute hypocrite, what Lincoln had in mind. I would like here to quote again a speech that Lincoln made at Springfield, Illinois, on July the 17th, 1858. I am going to quote you his words. What I would most desire would be the separation of the white and black races. Now, this is verifiable. Let us go on a little bit further. In the same year, on October the 13th, and in the 6th joint debate with Senator Douglas at Quincy, Illinois, he said, and again I'm going to quote, this is Abraham Lincoln, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races which will ever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of the superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Oh yes, you've heard it correctly. This is the word that was spoken by Abraham Lincoln on October the 13th in 1858. One final quote now from Lincoln, and this time it was spoken when obviously there had been a reaction from the blacks. It was spoken to a committee of blacks at the White House on July 14th, 1862, just 1 year before the famous Gettysburg Address. Now, this is what he said. Remember the background? He is now in discussion with the committee of blacks at the White House. He said, "Why should the people of your race be colonized, and where? Why should they leave this country? This is perhaps the first question for proper consideration. You and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any other two races. Whether it is right or wrong, I need not discuss, but this physical difference is a great disadvantage to us both, as I think your race suffer very greatly, many of them by living among us, while ours suffer from your presence. In a word, we suffer on each side. If it is admitted, it affords a reason at least why we should be separated. It is better for both, therefore, to be separated. So Abraham Lincoln then was a great separationist. Now, from these statements, unless Lincoln suddenly reversed his viewpoints, the man had no intention of broadening his phrase, the people, to include the liberated slaves of the South. Now, against this, of course, there are those who have visited the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and they would say that he, Jefferson, had different views. This memorial to Jefferson has, according to the authorities, a statement that this great American made concerning the Negro. And it is recorded in the Jefferson Memorial, this view that Jefferson had. And remember that the background and the context is the Negro. And this is what you will find recorded. I personally have seen it. It says, "Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free." Now that is written. To show how the sinister political forces work, may I quote the rest of Jefferson's statement, which is not on the memorial? Continuing, he said, "Nor is it less certain that the two races equally free cannot live in the same government." This puts an entirely different complexion on Jefferson, which cannot be said to support the policies of modern American administrations. Now, the point behind all this is to show that, having found a principle which enjoys a popular support because of its ideals, the wreckers of the West utilized that principle in removing or perverting the area in which it was to operate. You will note that the area was the people. Again, I say there is absolutely nothing wrong with majority rule, provided the total electorate is of the same race. Today, and in the United States of America, the Negro population is 20 million in a total population of 220 million people, a minority. And yet, for some strange reason, this minority, through intimidation, rules America. Let us spend a few moments on this. I feel it is important. We're all familiar, of course, with the story of that which is going on in London, relating to the negotiations to, quote many phrases, return Rhodesia to legality. We're also familiar that America is backing the British government. Now, President Jimmy Carter, constitutionally the commander-in-chief of all branches of the United States Armed Services, had decided to send American troops to Rhodesia to help the British government and counter the possibility of an armed coup by the Patriotic Front against Abel Muzorewa, the Rhodesia's black prime minister. Now, this is not fiction, you know. A lot of people would be inclined to say, but this is purely fictitious. It isn't. On October the 26th this year, the Pentagon reported, and I quote, "unrest among ethnic enlisted men," which polite phraseology, of course, covers the simultaneous mutinies of black troops which broke out at the Infantry Training School at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Armored Training Center at Camp Campbell in Kentucky, and the Marine Barracks at Quantico, Virginia. Naturally enough, the American president has had to rethink his policy and to adapt it according to the wishes of the ethnics in his army. If they simply decided that a war in Africa was not on, America would not fight the war. It's as simple, my friends, as that. Now, how, it will be asked, can a minority, after all the blacks are only 10% of the American population, how can they wield so much power? In a recent Pentagon report, it was revealed that the American military machine has and is undergoing a radical change, and that today 31% of the fighting forces is black. In the overall economy of American society, the armed services appear to be a haven of refuge for the blacks who find permanent employment where otherwise, in the general economy, they could not survive. Since 1972, according to the Pentagon, statistics have revealed that the number of blacks in the U.S. Army has increased by 50%, and that there appears to be every indication that this percentage will increase. If the Pentagon is right in its assessment of this increase, the American capability as a fighting force will be limited to what cause the blacks deemed fit, thus limiting the United States foreign policy. Incidentally, and just by way of interest, it is estimated that 30% of all U.S. recruits cannot read beyond the 5th grade. And ironically enough, the 30% non-reading figure coincides with the percentage of blacks in the U.S. Army. I merely mention this as a rather remarkable coincidence. America today is a nation with a very mixed population, which is becoming more heterogeneous with every passing year. There has been and still is an invasion of America by aliens, and it would appear that those sinister forces which have been referred to earlier are concentrating all their efforts in making sure that the people who are to exercise the right of government are not the same composition as they were in history. In the United States, the Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization Service is Leonel Castillo, who set up a committee to create a U.S. policy on immigration, and he appointed a longtime friend, Maclovio Barraza, an identified communist, as its chairman. Now, just note the policy. Castillo gave an interview to a reporter of the Mexican news service Excelsior, and this is what appeared in print on November the 22nd. All right, it's a little bit in the past. It was in 1977. But this is the man who today controls the immigration into the United States of America. And this is the report that appeared in the newspaper. Quote, "The crime committed by the illegal workers is technical and is also critical of the judicial system that we have, because the act of a person looking for work to feed his family, even though he does it in a country other than the one where he was born, should not be considered a crime, but a right. We should have a revision of our system of justice, and not consider delinquents those who enter illegally into a country to look for work." Now, much more could be said of the utter corruption existing in the U.S. Immigration Department, but what I have said should show that illegal immigrants get very special treatment, always providing, of course, that they're not white. Although not quite the same as in America, the alien problem in Britain is certainly making itself felt. Here again, the people are being changed, and while still in the minority, the coloreds have made a very deep impact on the laws governing the land. Under the Race Relations Act, it has become illegal to discriminate against the coloreds, and yet it is not illegal for them, the coloreds, to discriminate against the Britons. In terms of the Commonwealth, British policy is geared to accommodate the 39 black members, no matter at what cost to their own kith and kin. The majority at large, and here, of course, the colored races are the world's majority, which is increasing as each year passes, regardless of their inability to meet their need of providing for this. The majority must be right. After all, it's democratic, and what they want or do must be accepted by the minority. You know, this white obsession with the will of the majority is once again, as history has demonstrated, an exploitation by those sinister forces which, having played on a principle, see that in its ultimate implementation, the minority must disappear, leaving only the majority. I would like to say quite categorically that this is not a black or colored concept, although, having been thrust, as it were, into the center of the arena, they're exploiting the situation to the fullest. Have you ever heard of the blacks, before the thought was put into their heads, claim that because they happen to be numerically superior, they had the rights now lavishly given to them? Quite on the contrary. What little history we have of them, and this only began when the white man made his contact with them, shows that it wasn't quantity that counted, but quality. In South Africa, where a handful of white men, comparatively speaking, overcame and defeated hordes of blacks, it wasn't numbers that maintained the victory and developed the land into the flourishing civilization that it is today. It was the quality of the people concerned. And this was respected by the blacks until they were told that they had been denied their rights and exploited by the white man. Prior to the propaganda, he entertained no such thoughts, nor did he ever think of trying to expel the white invader. His traditional concept was that he had been defeated. To the victor belong the spoils. This attitude was characteristic of the African mind and demonstrated in countless encounters which took place between the various African tribes. Now all has changed, and he suddenly discovers that because he has multiplied, he is entitled to rule the land, whether he has the capability or not. It is the numbers which count. And just as in the indigenous African economy, where numerous children, particularly females, were the source of wealth, they see in their simplicity that more children today will make them an irresistible majority to whom the whole land with its prodigious wealth belongs. Today, and within the white nations of the world, the majority mania is riding on the crest of the wave, and while they see it as justice where Africa is concerned, they fail to see that within their own communities they are obsessed with a minority mania, all in all. And no matter where he is, the white man who, let's face it, provided the world with everything that he enjoys, the white man and his interests must take second place to the colored majority simply because they happen to be more prolific in bed. What kind of a future is there for this world if the only criteria is quantity? The answer is best left to the imagination. However, there is something which those sinister manipulators of the destiny of the world have forgotten, and which they have totally ignored in the pursuit of their victory. This factor is quality. It was the quality of the European nations which created government, and yet those very nations today are quite prepared to hand world government over to those who, until the new mad dispensation, had a history of savage despotisms. There is, however, something more to the subject of quality, and this centers on the fiber of the people who historically made their mark on human history, even though they were at all times in the minority. While today the white man is witnessing the eclipse of his civilization, while he sees that quantity is the only criteria for depriving him and his children of what sweat and hard work have earned, a resentment is slowly building up. And just as comparatively modern history has shown, while slow to anger, injustice and unrighteous norms have triggered off violent reactions. The end of majority mania is not yet, my friends, and it is my conviction, shared by countless numbers of true patriots, that the end is going to be very different to that which our sinister opponents, the anti-God, anti-Christ faction, imagines. How much longer this mania continues, and how much more we must give to appease the power-hungry maniacs who rule this world, depends upon the reawakening of God's people. Yes, my friends, God's people. We need to be awakened to the need of the times. It is coming because God has said so.